Throughout World War II, there were many men and women who were executed in secret behind the walls of forts, prisons, or inside concentration camps. Many who had resisted the German occupation were shot or were even guillotined for their offences, but the Allied armies even carried out some secret executions themselves on their own soldiers. In the decades and years after the end of the conflict, the true story of what happened to these men and women emerged, and they had been forgotten about. In this documentary, we look at 5 secret executions of World War II, from the unknown Allied soldier executed to the German officer who refused to take part in an execution. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Joseph Schultz was born in 1909 and he lived in Barmen. Little is known about his early life, but it's believed that he was a soldier who then joined the military in the Wehrmacht. But during the Second World War he was a corporal, and he was part of the 714th Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht. This division had been formed in May 1941, and it was then transferred to Yugoslavia to be involved in anti-partisan and anti-resistance missions inside the country. They were also part of the security operations inside of Yugoslavia, and throughout the Second World War they would be involved in huge anti-partisan raids. The partisans following the German occupation of Yugoslavia rose up, and they then moved to the mountainous regions, and they caused chaos with the German army. Partisans would conduct sabotage operations and would recruit many more people to their cause, but if the Germans found a partisan, then they would demonstrate brutality to them. Many partisans were arrested and were then tortured and interrogated heavily for information about partisan operations and activities. If someone gave over no information, they would be considered a lost cause, and for this they would be sentenced to death. One young teenager who was condemned and executed for this was Lepa Radic, a 17-year-old girl who helped to evacuate wounded partisans from the battlefield, and she was then taken to a gallows, where she was executed by the Wehrmacht in front of a crowd in shocking scenes. But the 714th Infantry Division continued to conduct acts of terror against the partisans. They wanted the population to fall into line and to not disrupt the Germans. The division was implicated throughout the war in a number of war crimes, especially as the war went on, and these soldiers were used to fighting in rough terrain and in the foothills, as well as being used as shock squads in urban areas. They would fight between the mountains and the plains, and they were known as a Jaeger division or a hunter division. They were very highly trained. But Joseph Schultz was a member of this division, but during the conflict, little attention was given to the fact he was said to have died during operations in Yugoslavia on the 19th of July 1941. He was recorded in German military circles as dying on duty, but this was allegedly not the case, and his death was an execution, which was considered strange and bizarre. However, on the 20th of July 1941, the Germans had collected a group of 16 Yugoslav partisans, and they had been gathered inside of a barracks of a town southeast of Belgrade. The Germans brought these resistance fighters out into the open, and they were then stood against a wall. The executioners were stood with their rifles, and the partisans leaning against the wall were blindfolded before the firing squad shot and executed them. However, following the end of the Second World War, the bodies of these victims were exhumed from a mass grave, but it was said from eyewitnesses that one of the remains of the people executed had a significant amount of German military relics and equipment on their person. Their ID tag had been lost, but it was clear that amongst the executed was a German soldier. There was a memorial then made in 1947 to the name of a Croatian victim named Marcel Masic, and it was said that there was a German soldier executed at the time along with these partisans, and that this German soldier was actually executed for refusing to take part in the execution of the partisans. But then, roughly 15 years after the war had come to an end, West German newspapers published images from the date of the executions, and in this they showed a German soldier who was stood walking towards the partisan victims against a wall, and he was too without a helmet and a belt. The Germans were asked to help identify this person, and the photographs were taken by a Wehrmacht unit, and they were then left behind when the unit left to go to the Eastern Front. The newspapers spoke of a defection of a German soldier, but then a member of the Bundestag came forward and he identified the person in the images as Joseph Schultz. He identified him based on the diary of the commander, Friedrich Stahl, the commander of the 714th Infantry Division. In this he managed to link Schultz to the place of execution, and the story began to come together. A Yugoslav newspaper would claim that Joseph Schultz had in fact been an underground member of the opposition to Hitler, and that he had been found out. But eyewitnesses to the execution also confirmed that a German officer was seen at the time arguing with other Germans, and that this specific man had no insignia on his uniform, and he had been stripped of them. The German officer in charge was furious and outraged, and with this it was Joseph Schultz who was allegedly getting the barrage of abuse. What had emerged during the executions of the partisans was that allegedly Joseph Schultz, while stood opposite the people he was meant to be executing and shooting, he could not do this. He had refused to take part in the firing squad and the execution, and because of this he was found guilty of desertion and cowardice on the spot. He was then screamed at by the officer in charge, who then forced him to stand with the condemned, and he was then executed alongside the partisans, before he was buried in a rough grave, and his insignia had been stripped, court-martialling him, and also making his remains difficult to identify, but then his remains were disinterred later. Eyewitnesses also claimed that this occurred, but there was some rejection to the story of Joseph Schultz and his execution. There was a significant study launched in 1972, and a report that looked into Schultz, and it claimed that the soldier in the image heading towards the partisans ready for the execution was not him, and they questioned that Schultz had already been allegedly killed when the executions took place. It was claimed that he had been reported dead to Army Command on the 20th of July around 2 a.m, and that this information was then passed to his relatives about this. With this, some historians had claimed that Joseph Schultz was not the man who was executed with the partisans. However, following the war, Joseph Schultz still remained a popular point of debate in Yugoslavia, and there was a memorial created at the execution site, and Joseph Schultz's name was added to the victims of the 16 Yugoslav partisans who had been shot that day. Many believe today that it is Joseph Schultz, but without DNA testing, the legend cannot be put to bed. Films have even been made about this, but the true story of Joseph Schultz is one that needs telling. What happened to him during the fighting against the partisans? He must have also been a very well-trained and skilled soldier, but it's very possible that his date of death may have also been ill-reported by the German military or command to cover up the execution of a German soldier. But still today, Joseph Schultz's story is one that needs clearing up and sorting out, to confirm if he was actually the man who was allegedly, according to the eyewitnesses, executed alongside the partisans. If he was, it would be a remarkable and shocking execution, a German soldier being executed alongside the enemies of his people. But there were accounts during the Second World War of German soldiers being court-martialed and quickly executed for cowardice, desertion, and even treason. There were some Germans who refused to execute the enemy, and because of this, they were considered guilty of a medieval crime of treason, and they faced the ultimate punishment. Edward Joseph Leonsky was born on December 12, 1917, in New Jersey. He was the sixth child of his parents who were Russian immigrants. It was noted that his family life at the time was not stable, and Eddie grew up in an abusive family where his parents abused alcohol and were reliant on it. One of his brothers was also placed inside of a psychiatric institution, and it was said that his mother was controlling and overprotective. Leonsky was regarded as a mummy's boy, and he was picked on by local children in his neighbourhood. Despite his childhood not being ideal, no one would know the monster that Eddie Leonsky would become. It was later said that his crimes were born from a resentment or hatred of his mother, and they even wished to kill her at one point. Following his schooling, he worked as a delivery boy for a local business, but as America entered the Second World War, Leonsky was called up for military service in the army. This must have been a very interesting time for the young man, as he was seen leaving his home and leaving his family behind that inflicted damage upon him. But little did Eddie Leonsky know that when he left for the army, he would never see his family again in America. He was called up for the army in February 1941 and was transferred to Australia, and in particular Melbourne, arriving there on the 2nd of February 1942. US soldiers were based in Melbourne at the time, and and it was said that when they arrived, they brought with them jazz music, chocolate bars, nylon stockings, and other luxuries. But amongst their midst, they also brought with them a serial killer. The country itself had been living on the edge for some time, as a few months before, 242 Japanese aircraft had attacked Darwin in the north of Australia, killing hundreds of people. There was censorship in Australia at the time, and panic was going through the civilian population, and more shelters were being built. Guard posts were being established on the coast to prevent a Japanese attack or invasion, but many people thought the country would fall. The Australians turned to the US to help, and in Melbourne in 1942, a large American tent settlement turned up, named Camp Pell, based in the Royal Park near to the city's zoo. It was a time inside Melbourne of great fear, and things were to get worse. Eddie Leonsky lived inside of Camp Pell, and his job was to prepare breakfast in the tented city for the American soldiers. Because of this, it meant his day was done at around 11 a.m, meaning that he had the rest of the day to do what he liked if he wanted. He was known for drinking himself silly, getting drunk before midday, and also going to the local pubs and inns and getting into fights. He was also a bit of a show-off, but Leonsky would be known for more than just being a drunken American soldier. He began a crime spree in which he would murder 3 women inside of the city. On the 3rd of May 1942, after being in Melbourne for a few months, a 40-year-old woman named Ivy Violet McLeod was found dead inside of Albert Park. She had been beaten savagely and was strangled to death. Her murder stood out as the killer left her purse, and this was found on her body, which meant they were not dealing with a robber, but a cold-blooded killer. Her body had been left half naked and was arranged in a horrific position. The authorities tried to find a lead, but nothing came up until 6 days later another woman's body was found. The body of 31-year-old Pauline Thompson was found after she had been on a night out, and it was noted that she was last seen spending time with a young man who was described as having an American accent. Eddie Leonsky had been drinking gin squashes with Thompson, who was a talented singer who had come to Melbourne to perform for the American soldiers. As she kissed him goodnight, he killed her, strangling her to death. These murders caused great panic amongst the Melbourne population and hinted towards one of the American soldiers being a serial killer. One of those men brought to hopefully help protect Australia was in fact terrorising it. Women in the city began to panic, thinking that every American soldier they saw could have been the killer. The killer began to be known as a brownout killer, given as Melbourne during wartime kept low light in the city and not a full blackout. 15 days after the first murder, Eddie Leonsky would strike one final time. Gladys Hoskins, who was 40, was murdered while she was walking home from work at the chemistry library at the University of Melbourne. She was a woman like the other victims who had carved out her own way in life, but it would be taken by Leonsky. After murdering Hoskins, he made an error, as later that evening he approached another woman and asked her for directions. He was out of breath and covered in mud. Once this information was given to police, the description given of Leonsky matched the man who was seen with Pauline Thompson, and the survivors were able to pick out Eddie Leonsky, the 24-year-old serial killer, out from a lineup of American servicemen. It was also noted how he attacked other women at the time, as these survivors were also able to help identify him. Eddie Leonsky's crimes shocked Australia and the American military, and he was placed on trial charged with 3 murders. Despite his trial occurring on Australian soil, it was conducted under American military law, as he was a member of the military. Leonsky confessed to the crimes and was sentenced to death at a court-martial hearing on the 17th of July 1942. His sentence was appealed, but this was rejected by General MacArthur, who confirmed the death sentence. It was MacArthur himself who even signed the order of the execution to ensure that Leonsky paid for his crimes. For MacArthur, Leonsky had brought needless terror to the country and had caused relations between the Melbourne population and his forces to become strained. There were issues as to who would perform the execution, and the executioner was given guaranteed anonymity for 75 years, and all we know is that he was a short and solid man who brought his own tools for the job. He used a coiled nylon rope 2 centimetres thick to perform the job. Eddie Leonsky was told of his execution a few days before, and he studied the method of execution over the weekend, knowing that somewhere in the prison, gallows were being built for him. He knew the gallows were being tested to ensure his death was quick and clean. He knew all of the procedure, but it was said it didn't bother him. 2 priests came to see him, and they had a Thanksgiving service with Leonski before they offered him a cigarette, and after a few puffs on the 9th of November 1942, he was brought for his execution. A US Army officer arrived in his cell and said, "Private Leonski, in the name of the United States, you are now called upon to have the verdict of the court carried out." The officers accompanied him to his place of execution, and he was asked if he had anything to say, and he did not. He was led into a room where the gallows had been made, and the executioner in a leather mask stepped forward. He secured Eddie's legs in his hands, and also placed a black cloth cap over his head. Eddie nodded his head to the American doctors who he had sensed, and then the priests prayed in Latin. The hangman then secured the rope and noose over Leonski's head, and a witness said to him, "I'm sorry, buddy," but Leonski replied, "It's okay, pal, carry on." Then the hangman adjusted the noose, with the knot sitting under the angle of his jaw and on the left side of his neck. He then stepped back from the trapdoor, and the American guards did the same. He grabbed the lever and pulled in one swift motion, opening the trapdoor, and Leonski's body fell. Instantly he was killed by the drop. Eddie Leonski terrorised Melbourne during a few months, and he paid for his murderous spree with his life. He was permanently interred in the Schofield Barracks on the island of Hawaii, in a place marked for prisoners who died in military custody. He claimed he killed the 3 women as he had a twisted fascination with female singing voices and wished to take them from the women. He is remembered today as a brownout strangler, a dangerous and psychopathic serial killer who under the Second World War committed horrific crimes and was incredibly dangerous. When Harold Pringle joined up to fight in the Second World War, he was just 16 years old. He willingly signed up for the fight, despite being underage, but was accepted. His father had fought in the First World War and had a rather illustrious career in the Canadian Army, and no doubt it's believed that Harold wanted to follow on in his father's footsteps. His father had been a marksman and was proud about his service, and together they tried to sign up for the Second World War, but Harold's father was refused due to his poor eyesight. Despite being only 16, he was a constant thorn in the side of the military. Harold Pringle lied about his age, and despite being known for being courageous in battle, he was known for having a temper and also going AWOL. Pringle would go out on leave when he wanted to and would not return. This made him a constant deserter, and time again he would repeat this sort of behaviour. This was not accepted in the army at the time. However, it was dealt with more leniently than it was in the First World War. In World War I, deserters were shot at dawn, being tied to posts and being shot by a firing squad. This resulted in hundreds of British soldiers and Commonwealth soldiers being executed, and a number of these were very young men. Private Harold Pringle was fined a number of times and was also placed in a military prison for his desertion, and much of his time disappearing was due to him visiting towns to see women who had become his girlfriend. Pringle was even sent to reformatory camp for a year, but then escaped after serving only 6 months. He was known for just taking off to see these women when he wanted, however it had disastrous consequences for him. Pringle was part of the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment, which have a rich military history. During the Second World War they were mobilised as soon as the conflict broke out, and they travelled to Britain and then on to France as part of the 2nd British Expeditionary Force. In 1943 they were part of the Sicily landings on the 10th of June 1943, and then landed in September in Italy. It was during their campaigns in Italy that Pringle managed to regroup with his battalion and then saw action. It was noted how when he arrived in Italy for a short while, he did what he was told and had an unblemished service record. However, he linked up in Italy with some British deserters, and together with Pringle, they created a black market outfit who were intent on getting rich and causing chaos within the Italian local economy. Pringle and a friend, John Lucky McGillivray, were part of a group known as the Sailor Gang. These men had all fled their responsibilities and units and ran to Rome to make a healthy amount of money selling black market goods. Inside of Rome, the members of the Sailor Gang were living the high life, whilst they were all in fact criminals who had shirked their military units. They started off well, selling black market goods for big profits, but as they got more greedy, things went downhill. Their behaviour began to become more debaucherous and raucous, and they were always drunk. They would drink themselves under the table, even during the day, and would get into fights with locals. The business decisions they made also became more risky and rash, and it resulted in a shocking event that ultimately led to the execution of Harold Pringle. The men were living ultimately as minor gangsters, trying to get rich quick and to evade the Second World War and conflict. During one evening, there had been an argument between two members of the group whilst drinking, and it resulted in the shooting and death of Pringle's friend, Lucky McGillivray. According to the official court proceedings, which took place later, Pringle and the victim, Lucky McGillivray, were absentees in Rome last autumn and joined a Chicago-type gang. This gang also comprised of absentees from the British Army, the US Army, and an absentee petty officer cook from the Royal Navy. On the evening of the 1st of November 1944, one of the houses where the gang lived in Rome, Lucky and Charlie Honess, a British sapper, quarrelled, and Charlie shot Lucky in the abdomen with a revolver. The shot went through his liver. Honess and Pringle then picked up Lucky, still alive, and put him in a jeep. The accused then drove and were accompanied by other gang members. They went southeast from Rome, and during the journey Lucky said take it easy. After travelling around 14 kilometres, they turned up a lane. Just before, Lucky asked where they were taking him, and the men said they were taking him to a hospital. About 1,600 yards up the lane, Lucky was lifted out of the jeep and placed on the ground. This was about 30 minutes from the time of the first shot. The accused, Harold Pringle, then shot Lucky again, near his heart with a revolver. The Royal Navy petty officer cook, Bill Croft, then after shot 2, borrowed Pringle's revolver and shot Lucky in the forehead. They then put Lucky in an irrigation well, and Pringle threw a branch over him. They then drove back to Rome, where they distributed Lucky's clothing amongst themselves and burned anything of his identified nature. Lucky's body was found the next morning by some Italians. At trial, Pringle confessed that he had shot Lucky, and each of the defendants said they did so to obliterate his features to avoid identification. However, Pringle stated that when he had shot Lucky, Lucky was already dead. The courtroom debated this, as if he had died before he was shot by Pringle. This would not have been murder by Pringle. A pathologist who performed the autopsy on Lucky stated how he believed it was a combination of the 3 gunshots that killed him. He said that after the first shot, as no major blood vessel had been hit, Lucky could have lived for up to 10 hours. He also said the combination of the 3 shots would have either killed Lucky instantaneously or within 2 minutes, and that Pringle's shot would have quickened death. The shot Pringle fired was in the left side of the chest and passed through the lung. But interestingly, another pathologist debated that he believed Pringle's shot occurred certainly after death, meaning that Pringle would not have been guilty of murder, and in a sense was firing a bullet into a corpse. He also stated that he believed the 3rd shot was fired into the head after death too, and that shots 2 and 3 were done after the victim's heart stopped beating. The whole debate regarding the trial centred around when Lucky McGillivray had died, and whether Harold Pringle had in fact killed him, or contributed to the murder. It was confirmed by another member of the gang that Lucky was alive when he arrived down the Italian lane, but the whole debate was up to the court-martial and trial to decide. The various members of the gang were placed on trial, but the judges still needed to work out who and when Lucky had been killed. It was clear that they were all complicit and involved in the murder and the dumping of the body. The medical evidence was also rather conflicting, as it was said that one statement says that immediately before shot 2 the victim was alive, another that he was dead, and a third that a pathologist could only surmise on probability or possibility of death. In the case of Harold Pringle, he was sentenced to death by shooting for his involvement in the murder of his friend. It was clear he had shot the man, and he contributed to his death, and it's possible his previous as a deserter had an impact on his sentence. He did appeal, but this was rejected. His prison cell looked out towards Mount Vesuvius, and he was guarded by British sentries. It was noted he was a cheerful prisoner who even played gin with the guards, and since his court-martial he tried to forget about the death sentence. He was visited by a priest who spoke to him regularly during his imprisonment, but ultimately it was down to the Canadians and not the British to execute him. From the court records we can learn what happened to Pringle during his execution. His execution was performed in strict secrecy, as the Canadian Army did not want it to get out that they had to execute one of their own soldiers who were involved in murder. The court document stated that the place of execution should be secluded and near to the place of confinement, and the best time to do the job was after dawn. Arrangements were made for a firing squad consisting of 1 sergeant and 10 soldiers from the prisoner's unit to be gathered. They were to stand 10 or 12 yards from the prisoner, and then signals would be given before. Pringle was brought to the site of execution, and he was then secured either to a chair or a wooden post. The men selected to shoot Pringle were not happy with their assignment, and they were not happy with the task of shooting one of their own, despite the fact he was involved in desertion and murder. The execution of Harold Pringle was so secret that the exact location is not known. According to the preparations for the execution, he was offered a sedative injection and an alcoholic drink before facing his firing squad. He was then tied to a post or a chair with straps and rope. Pringle was then given a black cap, which was placed over his head, and an aiming mark was placed over his chest for the men to aim at. The officer in charge also carried a loaded revolver in case Pringle needed a coup de grace, and he would have been shot dead within minutes of him arriving at the place of execution. There are confirmation statements in the case file that state Private Harold Joseph Pringle Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment was executed by shooting at Avellino, Italy, at 800 hours on the 5th of July 1945. The execution was carried out in the manner mentioned before. A doctor stated how, immediately after the execution of said Private Pringle, I examined his body and found him to be dead. So the execution of Private Harold Pringle is a rather debatable one. It's clear, however, he was involved in shady practices, manipulating the black market in Rome, all whilst he should have been fighting in the Second World War. Interestingly, one of the men who was involved in the murder of Lucky McGillivray was offered immunity to testify against Pringle. The case is rather debatable, and Pringle remains the only Canadian soldier executed by his own soldiers in the Second World War. In the build-up to D-Day, the British and Allied nations were planting spies inside of France to work with the French resistance. They would play a key role in the Normandy landings, disrupting and delaying the Germans, who would make their way to the north of France following the landings. But the French resistance were known to have been a brutal foe for the Nazis, and they were a feared enemy. If members of the resistance were discovered, they were usually executed quickly and swiftly by the Germans, with very little questions asked. Some were sent to concentration camps where they were then killed by the conditions there. They did play a key role in the rapid advance for the Allies through France following D-Day. There had been activity inside of France for many years, even as soon as the Germans occupied the country. There were many hardline policies taken by the Nazis against the resistance, and different elements such as the Maquis went to live and take up arms in the mountains and forests. These men were difficult for the Germans to hunt down, and 1944 in particular was a key year for the resistance. But one man who was a member of the French resistance was Edmond Reviel. He was a man who had lived with a secret for decades, and at a meeting of the National Veterans Association in 2019, he stood on his feet and spoke to the other veterans about a mass execution of German soldiers that he had witnessed and been a part of. It was said that when he spoke, it was like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and the mayor said, over the years he had plenty of opportunities to tell the story and never did, but he was the last witness. It was a burden to him. He knew that if he did not speak out, then no one would ever know. What this elderly Frenchman was talking about was the executions of around 40 German soldiers that had taken place at the hands of the French resistance. Following D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, resistance fighters had staged a small uprising in Tulle, the capital of the Corrèze department, and during this between 50 and 60 German soldiers were taken prisoner by the resistance fighters. 3 days after D-Day, the Germans fought back. They then publicly hanged and executed 99 of their own hostages. In the days following D-Day, more horror would occur as the Germans would discover the charred remains of Helmuth Kämpfer, an SS commander who had been locked inside of a field ambulance, and this had been set on fire. Following this, the SS Das Reich Division massacred 643 people inside the village of Orada-sur-Glane. Women and children were locked in the church, which was then set on fire, and men were locked in the barn and were shot by machine gun fire, before the barn was then torched. The village became a ghost town, and it still stands today as a memorial, but Edmund Reviel had taken part in the Tulle uprising, and then he joined a party of resistance members that went towards the east. He said none of the resistance groups wanted anything to do with the prisoners they had taken. We didn't know what to do with them. So these men accompanied the German prisoners they had captured. They then took them to Meymac. Some of the prisoners had become separated from the main group, and it was said if a prisoner wanted to take a pee, he needed to be guarded by two of us. We hadn't planned anything for food. We were under the orders of an Allied command centre, and they were the ones who gave us the order to kill them. Edmund Reviel is today the last surviving member of the local resistance group of the FTP, and he would then personally witness the executions of up to 40 German soldiers at a place referred to as Le Vert. Amongst the inmates and the prisoners were other members of the Wehrmacht, but also other collaborators, including a French woman who had collaborated with the Gestapo. But after receiving the order to kill them, the resistance members did not want to shoot her, and they drew straws, and the loser had to shoot her. The commander of this group who was guarding the soldiers was codenamed Hannibal, and it was said he cried like a kid when he got the order, but there was discipline in the resistance. He asked for volunteers to carry out the order. Every fighter had someone to kill, but there were some of us, and I was one of them, recounted Reviel, who would not take part. Reviel then told what happened with the executions. In the countryside, he said, it was a terribly hot day. We made them dig their own graves. They were killed and we poured quicklime on them. I remember it smelled of blood. We never spoke again. For over 75 years this secret would remain close with the witness, and it's clear that it must have played on his mind, that if he didn't get it off his chest, then it would have gone with him to the grave. The rest of the executioners who massacred the dozens of soldiers had died, but this would not be the end of the story. It was believed that in the 1960s, a group of archaeologists uncovered the remains of 11 German bodies from Le Vert. But then the excavations came to a close, and there were no records stating the exact place of the dig. This was done in complete secrecy, and a local man remembered seeing the excavations and discoveries, and he has now collaborated with modern archaeologists today. This is because in the next few weeks the German War Graves Commission are going to be searching for the remains of the missing German soldiers who were executed. The 98-year-old resistance member's testimony has also been used to try and pinpoint where these people's remains are. There has been a lot of discussion in the media regarding the search for the remains of the executed German soldiers and collaborators. The thought by Reviel, the 98-year-old man, is that he wants these dead soldiers to be remembered and for their stories to be told to the families, so that a memorial can be placed near to the spot. But there are many other atrocities and war crimes that were committed by the French resistance, but also there are war crimes that have been committed by German soldiers. Many of these still today have not been uncovered, and the victims remain in their graves under the ground. Still around Europe there are huge mass graves of victims who were executed by the Einsatzgruppen, or were killed inside of the concentration camps. Many of these people have been exhumed and laid to rest inside a proper burial site. There are also some unknown German soldiers who had even been buried inside of Britain, who died in prisoner of war camps here. But whether the 40 German soldiers who were executed at Le Vert can be found, or have been found, is yet to be known. It's believed that 11 were exhumed, but that leaves around 30 to be discovered. But the testimony of a 98-year-old man has brought the executions of the Second World War into the forefront of the world's mind and consciousness, decades on from the end of the deadliest conflict in history. The Genickschussenlager, or neck shooting facilities, were different extermination structures which were designed to appear that they were innocuous rooms, but the reality was that death and slaughter occurred here on a mass scale. Prisoners, or sometimes prisoners of war, men who were not even on the records of the concentration camps, were marched into these rooms, and they would not come out alive. These facilities were used at Sachsenhausen, and they were used to carry out death sentences, which were imposed upon the prisoners for different crimes, such as being part of the camp resistance. Inside these rooms, which were windowless, firing squads or individual executioners brought the life of someone to an end, and their remains were then taken to the camp crematoria. Within the rooms at Sachsenhausen too, there were larger groups of prisoners who were executed in this facility. But the next shooting facilities, mostly on the whole, were deceitful rooms, which were designed to trick prisoners into thinking they would be getting some form of help and care. Inside of Buchenwald concentration camp, these rooms were used en masse. Buchenwald was a huge site in which 280,000 people passed through the barbed wire fences, and over 56,000 died inside the camp. The site was brutal, and there were many terrifying guards who worked here to bring the lives of inmates to an end. For example, Walter Gerhard Martin Sommer, who was known as a hangman for the fact he crucified 2 priests upside down. When the camp was liberated, one of the journalists who witnessed the evils of Buchenwald stated, "I asked to see one of the barracks. It happened to be occupied by Czechoslovaks. When I entered, men crowded around, tried to lift me to their shoulders. They were too weak. Many of them could not get out of bed. I was told that this building had once stabled 80 horses. There were 1,200 men in it, 5 to a bunk. The stink was beyond all description. They called the doctor. We inspected his records. There were only names in a little black book, nothing more. Nothing about who these men were, what they'd done or hoped. Behind the names of those who had died, there was a cross. I counted them. They totalled 242. 242 out of 1,200 in 1 month. As we walked into the courtyard, a man fell dead. 2 others, they must have been over 60, were crawling towards the latrine. I saw it, but will not describe it." There was a huge amount of death at the camp, much caused by the conditions of the site, where inmates were treated awfully and were given hardly any food, but were also forced to work incredibly hard. One former prisoner of the camp stated that the majority of executions at the camp took place using shootings in the spine at the base of the head, the neck shooting. This man's job was to look after the radio at the camp's execution block, and he counted the prisoners who were shot, arriving at the number of 8,483 Soviet prisoners of war being shot within the next shooting facility. The camp's former commandant, Karl Otto Koch, a man who was later sentenced to death by the SS for embezzlement and murder, was even executed inside this facility by his former guards, being shot either by a makeshift firing squad or by a sole executioner. The next shooting facility executions at Buchenwald were carried out under what was known as the Commissar Order, and thousands of Soviet prisoners of war were sent there to be executed. They were not admitted to the camp, but were shot at the front of the camp, just outside of the boundaries of Buchenwald. The Gestapo sought individuals who were classed as commissars, who were then sent to Buchenwald and were shot. The SS converted the former riding stables of their riding hall into the next shooting facilities, an execution facility of their own design. They wanted to ensure the shootings that happened there were swift and quick, and their executioners would use a single shot to the back of the neck to do this. The stables were quiet and were large, and a wall was created at the front to hide the prisoners going into the different execution chambers. The prisoners were led into the former hall stable, and these rooms looked like medical examination rooms, or rooms that a doctor would look at patients inside of. They had medical equipment inside, including a pivotal piece of equipment for the execution process, a height measuring device. Soviet prisoners of war were led towards the height measuring device, and the guard then lowered and recorded their height as if they were having a medical exam, but the guard then left the room. Behind the measuring stick was a small hatch, a tiny opening, which was opened as the prisoner was stood with their back to it, and an executioner then poked a pistol or gun through the hole and quickly fired into the back of the victim's neck as he was stood facing the other way. It was horrific and swift, and the prisoners of war who entered here genuinely believed that they would get some form of treatment and care before being admitted to the camp to work. After the shots rang out, the victims fell forward, and even the floor of the next shooting facility was painted brown to hide the bloodstains, and there was drainage built in to help clean up the chambers at the end of the day's shooting. The facility would not be cleaned straight away after an execution to not delay the proceedings. Following the death, the corpse of the victim was then placed in a metal cart, and this was then taken by other prisoners to the crematoria and the bodies were burned. In this manner, there were 8,000 prisoners of war who were shot in this way inside of Buchenwald. After over 8,000 executions within the camp, the facility was then stripped out and was made to appear like a stable again to hide the crimes of what happened, but it has been recreated today in the way that it worked during World War II. Neck shooting as an execution method was deployed by the Einsatzgruppe inside of occupied lands, but within Buchenwald and a few other concentration camps, there were different neck shooting facilities established to bring the life of prisoners to an end in ruthless, efficient ways. It was a concealed and hidden part of the Second World War and of the Third Reich's evil, and it is something that's not very well known about compared to the gas chambers. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.